Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hope you can hear me well. My name is DC, and I'll be speaking a little bit about our topic for today for The Last Defense. We're going to be talking about the cost of war and just how expensive it's actually going to be for the United States and Iran to carry out its war, especially on the US side. And the reason why we talk about this is because there have been some headlines taking place that have really kind of put things into perspective as to just how much or how expensive this specific, ongoing campaign in the Middle East region is going to take, especially for the United States and Washington. Before we get started, if you like what you see here, always just like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to also hit that notification bell so that way you don't miss any updates. And we're going to just go ahead and kick things off here. So firstly, I'd like to bring up the first article. We're looking at Pete Hesgeth, who is actually talking about what he wants to do in the Iran-Iraq, not the Iran-Iraq war, but the US-Iran war. What we're looking at here specifically, we're talking about the fact that he has sent a message out to, or he's actually gone to Congress for like a hearing to actually ask for more money. And this is going to be quite interesting as we see that according to his figures, he says that it's cost the US 37.5 billion so far. And they want more money. Actually, they've requested, if I'm not mistaken, there's another 67 billion so that they can do this for operations in the Middle East. And I think that's going to be quite expensive tab to foot for this. It's not just something you can just ask for. So actually here, it's 87 billion in congressional funding for the Pentagon, with 67 billion of that destined for operations in the Middle East. So of the 87 billion that they want in funding from, for the Pentagon, he actually wants to use 67 billion of that just for the operations in the Iran, ongoing skirmish. And so this is actually triggering a lot of issues. And one of the things is that previously, already, the White House has asked Congress, and this was done in April, for 1.5 trillion to fund Pentagon wars in the Middle East, at least for the full fiscal budget, which a lot of those assets and resources have been diverted from the theater in the Asia Pacific and other parts of the world so that they can focus solely on Iran and the Strait of Hormuz at this time. So this is a very kind of unnerving situation. There have been, I think we're now currently in the 13th day of proposed strikes that US President Donald Trump has asked to do. And over 13 days, they've used quite a substantial amount of weaponry, which over time is going to become quite difficult for them to sustain, because we've already known from certain sources that the United States is running out of munitions, and they're also running out of specific munitions critical to their military offensive strategy. These include HIMARS missiles. We also think about THAAD, high altitude missiles, things like that, Patriot missile systems, radars, drones, and other things like that. So a lot of these assets have been hit in the Middle Eastern region. Iran has decimated the US's capability to continue waging the war in the strategic way that they have initially thought that they could. And so it's going to become more and more expensive as they need to replace those systems. It's going to take much, much longer because, according to estimates, it takes about anywhere from 3 to several years for the Pentagon to actually, well, not the Pentagon, but the defense contractors working for the Pentagon, such as Northrop Grumman and Boeing and others, to manufacture these missile systems, because of the kind of supply chains that they require, this system of checks, a lot of the different processes within the supply chain are going to cost a lot of time and a lot of money. So one thing we want to look at, and one thing that we want to note about this, he says that he's asking for Congress to do these things. But one thing it's going to be really, really difficult for him to sell is the fact that this is going to cost way, way more than initially expected. So when we go to the next kind of tab that we want to look into, one thing we saw is that there's an official Iran cost of war tracker. And so according to this tracker, it's saying that it's already cost 113 billion US dollars, 113 billion point 3 300 million. And this was only over a 108-day period. And because of this, what this measured the cost of war based on the Pentagon's briefing to Congress. And additionally, this was for the first 6 days of the onset of the conflict, and then plus 1 billion US dollars per day. So on the premise that this is going to cost 1 billion a day, this is what the counter has said. But there's going to be some, other evidence that we can use to refute this, and some things that we may want to look into, because over 108 days, the counter stopped on June 16th, 2026. And this was in the period, I believe, right, during the time in which they were going for the memorandum of understanding. They were working, in Islamabad to try to create this and to sustain it with a ceasefire and a lasting peace that they could actually work with. So that ceasefire and that memorandum of understanding has now died. It's completely gone. Both sides are now fully entrenched in the war, and this means that the cost of this is actually going to go even higher. So this is something that people really, really need to understand when it comes to what's going on at this particular time. So I did a bit of the maths here, and if over 108 days, it cost the United States $113 billion. And this is, based on the first 6 days, plus 1 billion a day. My estimates actually came to, if this was to continue, we would actually be looking at over a 365-day period. It would actually cost the United States 381 billion. And then keeping in mind, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine, and it was a very spirited one, but it was very, very informative because I had the chance to actually look into it, that it would actually cost 2 trillion to equal the amount of money that was spent in the war in Afghanistan, because there was an initial period where they occupied the land, and then they had to pay for other things like training and other army munitions. So once the Marines go in, they occupy this, the civilian infrastructure with the Taliban. And then, of course, after that, they have to use the army to hold down the land. With this, however, they have not even done that. With 113 billion, the United States hasn't even launched its boots on the ground campaign, because they know it's going to be a bloodbath if they try that. So this is what a lot of this ramping up to soften up, if you want to say, or to try to attack the areas surrounding Strait of Hormuz, the Qasem Islands. I think they're now trying to do a massive attack on the Pickaxe Islands as well. And so this is not going to bode very well, because air campaigns do not necessarily guarantee success for any kind of military occupation, because that is not going to be sustainable, especially with the low amount of munitions and supplies. The fact that the Strait of Hormuz has been occupied, and there is a possibility that the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is already occupied by the Houthis, which is cutting off access to Saudi Arabia. So a lot of people are not getting supplies in. The US has its own blockade, which is more or less partially successful, fractionally successful, even I could say. And then additionally, you have this increase in the amount of military expense that they need, so much to the point now that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, is now commissioning U.S. Congress for them to increase the budget, because this is taxpayer funded. Anyone who's in the United States who's going to be paying that, they're going to try to create multiple sources of income. So it's going to be taxpayers. It's going to come from the tariffs that he's just recently introduced. He's reinstated the 10% tariffs across 60 different countries around the world, including the United Kingdom here, which, it was supposed to be the baseline tariffs, if I remember correctly, from way back when they first launched this. And this is now creating issues with Canada, with Mexico, a lot of other countries who have did not initially enjoy the idea of having tariffs launched upon their trade with the US and the ability to use and access US intellectual properties. So moving right along here, what we'll talk a little bit about are some of the other issues that are now kind of hamstringing a lot of these ambitions that the United States has. So we look at an article here that was quite interesting from, we'll bring this up, the Harvard Kennedy School. So looking into this, we talk a little bit about why the war in Iran is so expensive anyways. So I'm going to move this over here. We're looking at a lot of these issues that are taking place here. This was an article created in April. So remember, everything kicked back off in late February. I think it was February 28th. And so the war ramped up, and then there was a mission creep. And then after that, people started then to ask and answer the very, very important questions, surrounding a lot of this. So even looking at this, they talk a little bit about what causes these wars to become so expensive. And this is coming from, let's see what we have here. We have Linda Bilmes, and she is a fellow that is actually the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Senior Lecturer in Public Policy. And she's a leading expert on public finance and the financial cost of the war in Iran. So with this conversation that I think it was the Harvard Kennedy School had with her, we talk about what her thoughts were on this. So she said that wars always cost more than expected. Throughout history, those who go into wars tend to be optimistic about the cost and about the length of time it will take. For example, Russia thought it could take control of Ukraine in a few weeks. It's now over 4 years. Former President George W. Bush fired his economic advisor, Larry Lindsey, for predicting that the Iraq war might cost $200 billion and ended up costing $5 trillion. We see the same pattern in Iran. The Trump administration expected that this war would be over quickly and would be relatively inexpensive. But according to the Pentagon, it costs $11.3 billion in the first 3 to 5 days. But that is an underestimate. According to her calculations, those first few days cost at least $16 billion. We're spending down munitions at an extraordinarily fast pace. To put it into perspective, we fired more Patriot missiles in the first 4 days of the Iran war than we have given to Ukraine over the past 4 years. This is a damning admission here, because here's what we're noticing. The reason why there's a shortage in the stockpiles for the United States is that they manufacture for limited conflicts around the world. So a lot of these, defense contractors like Northrop Grumman, like Boeing, like Airbus, and Airbus is a European manufacturer, but when we focus specifically on people like even Raytheon and other American defense contractors, we're noticing that they manufacture for a certain level of demand. And then when that demand is exhausted, they have to create more contracts. However, the pace in which they have stockpiled a lot of these different weapons were for limited excursions. So they plan, and then they have their budgets, their mandatory and their discretionary spending, and they budget for those specific expenses. So when you're spending $3 billion on a Patriot missile or something like that, that costs a lot of money. And that's why Pete Hesgeth is actually running to Congress to try to get more money. But the problem with this is that each of those missiles, again, takes about several years, can take up to 10 years to manufacture due to the line of the project planning that's required to check to make sure that they fire correctly, to make sure that the intellectual property is secured, and also to make sure that there's sufficient quality control throughout the entire project process. And this is one thing that the United States gets very, very wrong. So what she talks about here, the short-term cost of the war in Iran, these are things like munitions, which are the missiles, bombs, and interceptors that we're firing, the cost of maintaining 2 or 3 carrier strike groups in the region with aircraft, submarines, destroyers, supply ships, etc., and the cost of maintaining personnel, combat pay, extended deployment pay, as well as the cost of unexpected things like the fact that we lost 3 F-15 fighter jets to friendly fire in Kuwait. And now that Iran has already shut down US aircraft, including an F-15 fighter, an A-10 attack plane, and multiple drones, we're losing at high cost assets. So she's again explaining that in April, up to April 7th, when there was that disastrous issue that took place in Iran, where there was an Apache helicopter, there were 2 F-15 fighters and so on that were lost in that period. That is an expensive loss for the United States. And that was in April. We are now entering into August nearly, and it's going to be probably, way, way more than that. So I estimate those figures to probably be somewhere around maybe about 250 billion. So it was 108 billion at the time in which the clock stopped in June 16th. Now, as we enter August, more of these assets have been lost in the Middle Eastern region, in the Persian Gulf, because of Trump wanting to up the strikes. And so he's shooting from all of these different military bases in Kuwait, Bahrain. He's shooting from Jordan, off the coast. He's got an aircraft carrier. I think it's like 1,000 miles off the coast of the Strait of Hormuz, or the Persian Gulf. And so we think about all these different things, and they're adding up. And so this is not, in my opinion, going to be a very sustainable kind of war that he can fight. So he's going to have more bellicose rhetoric in order to scare people into saying, oh, well, we're going to be able to win this. But in reality, it's bleeding out, it's hemorrhaging, the US military budget and, the US budget overall, in a time in which they don't have the means to do so. So what she also mentions is that the short-term costs are even higher than they appear. The Pentagon reports cost based on historic value of inventory instead of the actual cost. Now, this is extremely important for people to understand. These are historical value costs of inventory instead of the actual cost it takes to replace what we are using. Those costs are far higher. For example, the Tomahawk missiles being used are valued at around $2 million in each inventory, but replacing them today costs $3 to $3.5 million. Patriot missiles in the inventory were valued at $1 to $2 million, but newer versions cost $4 to $5 million each. So yeah, I got that figure wrong. It should be million instead of billion. The same is true for fuel and other supplies, which we're drawing down inventory purchased at lower prices and replacing them at much higher prices. We're thinking about things also like the ability to borrow. You have different kinds of treasury yields issues that are going to affect the U.S. ability to borrow and to incur debt. We also think about the fact that the new Fed has come in, and there could be policy changes different to what was from the outgoing Fed chair that would also allow the United States to have this flexible Keynesian, strategy with its money. They're also not accounting for the full cost of repair and maintenance, or for what it costs to keep forces deployed months beyond their planned rotations. And this, again, was before all of the US military bases were absolutely ravaged over the last few weeks due to Iran's precision fighting that it has used with its own, domestically built, weapons that it shoots, Shahed drones, it's, ballistic missiles, it's now got smart missiles that it can use to track and deflect any kind of attacks. So these are really, really complicated types of missile systems. And now with no interceptors, or very, very limited interceptors, more regional powers are going to be susceptible to getting hit hard because they have no defenses to actually take them out. This is why you see recently, reports showing that Kuwait and Bahrain were actually striking places within within Iran, rather than actually focusing on, intercepting them with, missile defense systems, because they have no interceptors, or very, very few. So they're saving those for when they actually need them. And those interceptors are going to take years for new ones to manufacture. So these are things that people need to kind of think about, especially when it comes to the cost of war. And, even when it comes to comparing it to like a war like Afghanistan or Iraq or anything like that. Now, I did extra calculations. Other people actually speculate that this war is actually going to take way more, because I'm seeing other reports showing that it's 2 billion a day. So imagine 2 billion spent every day that this goes on. We've already had 13 days. So if you do the maths, 2 billion times 10 is going to be 20 billion in just 10 days. So in the 13th day, that's going to rack up costs. And if we compare it to a timeline similar to the war in Afghanistan at the same level of cost, then my calculations found that it would take approximately 2.74 years, or that's 2 years, 273 days, or 2 years and 11 months before we reach the same expenditures on this particular trajectory at 2 billion a day, fighting a war in Iran. So the reason why, Donald Trump and the Pentagon and all of them are very, very kind of nervous, and rightfully so that they're nervous about getting rid of the, defense systems and the other systems that Iran's using, Iran is using them basically on a shoestring budget. You think about some of the Shahed drones that they're using, they cost as much as a Honda Civic, basically. And, and that's a Honda Civic from like last decade or something like that. It's just really no contest in all of this. And I think that what the United States has to understand is that this war on short levels of munitions, or, shoestring levels of munitions, with the amount it would take to procure a military and to occupy a land when there is no money and they have to run to Congress to receive more funds. And then on top of that, the cost of lives, because they've already reportedly 14 Americans that have been killed in this entire conflict since it began. We're looking at not just the material costs, but we're looking at the human lives, as well as the cost of the US petrodollar, which on the current trajectory, I can see that many of the Gulf allies, which struck this deal with the United States, back in 1971, that was the Saudis who said that in exchange for using exclusively the US dollar to buy oil and gas, we're actually going to allow you to sell your missiles, and that way we can better defend our interests within the Persian Gulf region. That is all coming to a disruptive end because the region is not safe. and it only took a matter of months for the entire region to unravel. And we have desalination plants in the UAE and in Kuwait and other places being hit. We have infrastructure being lost. Iran has planned this war for 35 years, ever since the end of the Iran-Iraq War, which ended in a stalemate. Now that I've researched that a bit better. However, what it did show is that when the United States supports specific allies in the Persian Gulf region, that doesn't ensure success, because those weapons of mass destruction they gave them, like the sarin gas, cyanide, and all of those other things they gave to Saddam Hussein under his tenure, that crippled the Iraqi economy. It crippled the Iranian economy as well. But what we notice is that war is a very expensive adventure. And the only way to win it is to not play at all. I think that there should be a stronger move towards diplomacy and avoiding selfish interests in foreign lands. I think if Trump had stuck to his America First policy, he would likely experience a much better outcome for the midterm season, and I think it would be a lot easier. It would have been a lot easier for him to at least to secure a majority in Congress at this time. So those are going to take place in November, the votes to go for the midterms in the United States. I predict that the Republican Party is going to get decimated, because people are realizing that as much as he has said about Democrats, and I'm not a Democrat, just to be clear, or a Republican, it is important to note that as much as he said that the previous party has made things, more expensive, and there's been a lot of inflation, which there was, the fact that Trump has deviated and gone to war in order to secure interest and to commandeer more of more of the global oil supply, I think that was a very, very foolish mistake. That there are more than one ways to pay for that, and I just pray that things come back to a sense of rationality and reason. So again, hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to leave it there, and until next time, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a lovely day. Bye now.